Hello and welcome to ID Talk, Answers from an Infectious Disease Expert. I'm Dr. Sean Elliott, a pediatric infectious disease specialist with Tucson Medical Center, Professor Emeritus of Pediatrics at the University of Arizona College of Medicine, and Medical Director of Infectious Diseases and Immunizations at the Arizona chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. This podcast has been created to answer questions from our chapter's members about the COVID-19 pandemic. This is the week of January 17th, 2022, and of course, Omicron continues to be quite a significant challenge in the COVID pandemic. Globally, we are up to 338,164,000 plus cases total since the start of the pandemic, with over 5.5 million deaths related to SARS coronavirus 2 in the world. In the United States, we've had a significant jump over the last 28 days. We are now at 68,500,000, almost 70,000 cases as of this morning as I'm recording this, January 20th. We have had 857,778 deaths related to the coronavirus in this country since the start. Perhaps even more telling are the totals over the last 28 days, where we've had 17 million of those 68 million total cases. So the actual attack rate, numbers of cases, has reached all-time highs, with well over 400,000 new cases reported per day, and in some cases, almost a million. So it's been quite obviously a significant impact from the virus, the Omicron variant, I should say, on health of humans in this country and worldwide. In terms of kids, they continue to be similar in terms of the percentage of numbers. The report from the American Academy of Pediatrics dated January 13th lists us as having 9,452,000 plus cases total, which is 17.8% of the total number of cases. That comes out to a rate of 12,559 pediatric cases per 100,000 pediatric age range patients. Again, as we look at weekly totals, the weekly total for the week ending in January 13th was 21.4% total cases in that week caused by pediatric patients. That is not the highest, it's not the lowest. We've been as high as 30%, and up until fairly recently had been averaging around 25%, so a quarter of all new cases caused by, or being seen in, I should say, pediatric patients. This is, I think, probably not a huge surprise. What is perhaps more telling is the clinical appearance that Omicron takes in kids, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Arizona specifically, our total number of cases in kids are 306,706 since the start of the pandemic. That is 19.9% of the total cases, and a rate of 16,681 per 100,000 pediatric age range kids, or I should say kids and young adults in the state. It's interesting that the percentage of total cases is closer to the national average for kids, so 19.9% versus 17.8%. It has been higher. Again, I'm sure we are all seeing plenty of cases of Omicron in kids, but perhaps they're being eclipsed by the sheer number of adults, young adults and others, vaccinated and otherwise, who are being diagnosed and confirmed as cases. Arizona stands at 54 total deaths since the start of the pandemic related in kids related to the pandemic. Again, as I've discussed several times in prior podcasts, a percentage about a quarter of these cases are specifically due to the virus itself and or its complications, typically in children who live in under-resourced parts of the states with decreased access to health care. The remainder of the deaths, however, are due to, by and large, trauma, motor vehicle accidents, firearm injuries, and completed suicide, all of which are attributed to the stressors and social changes related to the pandemic. So I spent some time talking about this about this difference in the last podcast. So while the virus remains overall fairly non-virulent for kids, there are certainly incredibly significant secondary stressors which are contributing to morbidity and mortality among pediatric patients. So what about Omicron and its current status? So again, I think we all know that Omicron likely represents an antigenic shifting event which occurred late last year in South Africa, potentially in a patient with uncontrolled HIV/AIDS. And that patient may have been infected simultaneously with a coronavirus OC43, one of the causes of common cold symptoms, and a very original strain of the SARS coronavirus 2, which may have been animal based. And so the Omicron variant itself came out with 50 plus new mutations, point mutations, 30 of those in the spike protein, and at least 10 of those 30 in the specific antigenic binding site of the spike protein, the way that the virus binds to its ACE2 receptor. What is different is that the virus is inserting itself or melding itself, I guess, with this target cell via the second of two pathways. And this pathway is typically more prevalent in upper respiratory tissue. So, animal studies, human tissue studies to date, and even population studies are all suggesting that Omicron is by and large more of an upper respiratory tract pathogen than have been prior variants, which are very definitely lower respiratory tract pathogens causing multifocal pneumonia, ARDS, respiratory failure, and death. So the Omicron variant, while it is still precipitating an incredibly huge number of new cases, by and large is not causing the same morbidity or mortality that we've seen with prior variants. That's great, wonderful, fantastic. However, it is manifesting differently, especially in kids, many of whom are coming in with more of the sore throat and fatigue cough presentation without fever being as prominent. But we're also seeing a significant increase, both Arizona and countrywide, in kids presenting with a croup-like illness. So that actually then is driving the admissions. And I'm sure all of us have had patients admitted to hospital or in our practices admitted to hospital with a croup-like illness who required perhaps some oxygen delivery and even dexamethasone, not necessarily for the indication of the SARS coronavirus infection, but to treat the croup. So definitely Omicron is behaving differently, which is wonderful. The patients, both adult and pediatric, who are being hospitalized more for complications of underlying diseases and or a croup-like illness that does require oxygen. So there you go. That's kind of where we're at, and that I think that accounts for the significant increase in numbers, but yet not a significant increase to date of the reported fatality rates. And this is exactly the pattern that played out in South Africa. A sharp, very nasty spike in total cases reported, but the death rate curves and hospitalization rate curves, while not flat, did not have the same peak or the same spike. And that is very true so far in this country. All of the pundits and predictors and mathematical modelers out there are still holding breath to see, is this truly going to be this way, or are we in for some nasty surprises in the next couple days as we get a month plus into Omicron and we start to see increasing deaths from patients who have been hospitalized for some time with chronic healthcare needs. So, how this is going to play out, I think I'm not going to predict. It would certainly be wonderful if Omicron truly is as less virulent as we would like to think it is. But honestly, the next couple weeks are going to be quite telling. Other predictions, of course, and we're all hanging on every single day, every single word of this. Could Omicron represent the beginning of the end? And this is certainly something I discussed at length in the last podcast. Again, still too early to tell. The wonderful Tony Fauci and also the team at CDC have all been saying, it would, wow, maybe perhaps that'd be great. Certainly Omicron represents the most successful variant to date of SARS coronavirus 2, which holds therefore a significant natural selective benefit. And if so, it may be that Omicron represents the transition of the COVID-19 pandemic into an endemic process where we'll have some version of SARS-CoV-2 for the foreseeable future, but it'll perhaps resolve into less of a significant, less of a virulent disease, and therefore the great societal changes which we've had to undergo may be able to be lessened. That's the hope, of course. I think we would all love that to be so. Meanwhile, we're all escalating our wearing of masks and escalating our attempts to get people vaccinated and escalating all of the social interventions that we've been doing in a setting, in a population that is sick and tired of this. I'm sure we all are as well. But the hope is that if this is the last hurrah, maybe we can help by these social distancing and masks and vaccines, etc., help the pandemic finally be mitigated into an endemic setting. I guess we'll have to see. Are there other variants out there? Of course. There are always going to be variants out there. In fact, there are currently several variants being tracked in the European Union and in Israel, and perhaps also in South America, although less well reported from data. And they have additional mutations and they behave differently, but so far they are not achieving the same societal impact that Omicron has. So small clusters of cases, not great big mass infections of whole communities. So I guess we'll see how that turns out. So we have a couple questions to go through today, and thank you for sending those in. Keep them coming. The first one, some are mentioning that the rapid antigen tests are not detecting the Omicron variant, and I've seen some recommend swabbing both nares and the oropharynx in a way to pick up Omicron. Is there data recommending this process, and what's up with that? So this is true, that Omicron, largely because of its antigenic shifting and therefore and the mutations associated with that, has conformational changes in the recognition site of the spike protein. That recognition site, of course, is what many of the rapid screening antigen-based tests are recognizing. So they're going to have a less strong binding and therefore less strong triggering of the reporter construct. And so indeed the sensitivity of the rapid screening tests, which are antigen-based, has suffered. PCR-based or nucleic acid testing-based, depending on which phrase you like, remain really quite sensitive and still remain the gold standard for confirming presence or absence of the virus. The challenge there, of course, is that the nucleic acid tests are going to detect viral RNA, which may have been around for a while. Certainly, I'm sure we all have patients who have screened repeatedly positive by PCR tests weeks to even perhaps months after an initial known infection. Certainly, we have colleagues who have experienced that. So while very sensitive, the nucleic acid tests, PCR tests, may be a bit too sensitive and may not help us understand if the patient is acutely infected. In that regard, the antigen test would be better. So perhaps more specific, the problem is with Omicron, they're not as sensitive. The other part of the challenge, of course, is, as the questioner alludes to, is that it may be the higher viral density of Omicron is going to be not so much the higher density of the virus is more likely to be found in the oropharynx, correlating with our kiddos that are presenting with sore throat and croup, and far less likely in terms of a viral density in the upper nasopharynx, and that may well be true, again, due to this variable binding of the virus. So yes, there have been anecdotal reports and some very early pilot research, not even studies, reports, I should say, that the sensitivity of the screening antigen tests is improved by swabbing both oropharynx and nasopharynx. I guess it's too early to make that a formal recommendation, but as a practice, scientifically, it does make sense. So if we're actually obtaining in our kits 2 swabs, it might be reasonable to do one nasopharynx with the usual practice and one from the oropharynx and submit them both into the testing construct. So, of course, hopefully there are research studies actively studying this. Just to date, I've not seen those even in pre-release form. The second question we have is, we'd like to know what's happening with COVID vaccines in the 6 months through 4 years age group. Yeah, so would I. So when last we spoke, the data released from Pfizer was that their new low dose formulation for this youngest of pediatric patients, which was 1/10 of the adult dose. So being listed as just like 3 micrograms. That dose did achieve a reasonable and, as expected, seroprotective response in infants ages 6 months up to 2 years. However, children, toddlers, I guess you could say, ages 2 through 4, did not achieve the desired or anticipated seroprotective response with a 2-dose regimen of that low-dose vaccine. In response to that, Pfizer has reopened that same study by administering a third dose, call it a third dose, call it a booster, whatever you like, but the third dose in a fairly close time frame to the receipt of the first 2 doses, and is now studying the impact of that in terms of lasting seroprotective response. Pfizer has released on its website the intention to go to the FDA with its data perhaps as early as next month, that being February or perhaps March, with a hope to have emergency use authorization by April. So that is the official story. I've seen, unfortunately, none of the data and no messaging at all from FDA or CDC or Pfizer as to any updates on that approach, other than that the study is actively ongoing. So we're kind of in a holding pattern, unfortunately. Boy, I guess that's a challenge because, as we can imagine, our parents are of 2 populations. The first is like, when can I get it? I want my kid to be safe, and I don't want my kid to bring home virus, whatever variant it happens to be, back to the family and infect, siblings, ourselves, grandparents, etc. The other population, of course, is, tell me why I need to get the vaccine for my younger child who's not likely to have severe disease in the first place. And that's a valid question. My response to that has been, it's not as much about the younger child being protected from the disease known as COVID-19, but more about that younger child now being found to be equally, if not more, or like highly infectious to other family members, that being adult caretakers and certainly to grandparents or immunocompromised family members. So it's all about disease control, source control, if you will, at the population level. And we can only achieve that by getting everyone vaccinated to reduce the overall circulating viral load. Knowing that at the very best, a third of the population in this country will remain vaccine refusers. Every other patient that we can vaccinate would be fabulous. That's the answer. So it's not so much a personal goal as a societal goal and perhaps a historic pandemic resolution goal. But that's all we've got. But we can't do any of that, of course, until the data is confirmed and released. That's for Pfizer. Moderna, strangely, has really seemed to drop off the radar, other than getting a booster approval for certainly age 16 and up, which was not from its initial data, but sort of extended by power of the CDC to include both Pfizer and Moderna's mRNA vaccines in their booster recommendation, and now, of course, recommending boosting doses for ages 12 and up. That is still specifically with Pfizer. Moderna has been studying the younger age groups, as per the question, 6 months and up, but there have been no status updates on results of those studies and level of efficacy and et cetera and so forth. The general sense, and this is just sort of under the wire rumblings, is that in the initial recruit of patients, Moderna's total numbers, denominator, was not sufficiently high to reach statistical power to actually identify a difference in efficacy, placebo versus vaccine. And of course that would make sense as we were going through periods where kids were not as infected and not as severely infected with the SARS coronavirus 2, and therefore not presenting for medical attention or being tested positive. So Pfizer apparently had to cast a wider net in its initial recruit and was much better positioned to achieve the numbers and the statistical power which both FDA and CDC were requiring. So I think Moderna was sort of caught a little bit behind and then maybe in its struggling to catch up period. So however that may be, we don't have any data from Moderna. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine, I think, as we all know, is by and large off the table. Certainly, there's been a fairly strong recommendation from CDC and of course the FDA to preferentially vaccinate with the mRNA vaccines due to the associated risk with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and AstraZeneca, if it were here, for the vaccine-associated or vaccine-induced thrombotic thrombocytosis and deaths related to that. That complication, of course, mostly reported in young adults and women more than men, but that also, again, means it has not been very successfully tested in younger patients. So I think we're really only looking at mRNA vaccines at this point until or if something new comes on along. So I guess we'll have to see. So that's it for the questions this year or this week. Maybe I wish the year was over already. Again, in terms of predicting how long this Omicron surge is going to happen, there are parts of the country, certainly in the East Coast, where they have already reached their peak and plateaued and are seeing actually declines in the attack rate for new COVID-19 cases. We may be starting to see that here in the Southwest and the West Coast. But again, we do tend to lag behind East Coast in typical viral studies, sometimes by as much as several weeks. So, as I said earlier in this podcast, the next several weeks will be quite instructive, and the next time we talk, I may have a completely different tune to sing. So, that's assuming I can sing. I don't know, these allergies are kicking it up. So that's it, folks. Thank you for listening to ID Talk. AzAAP members can submit questions for future episodes to covid@azaap.org. The AzAAP would like to acknowledge the generous support of this podcast by the Arizona Department of Health Services through the Title V Maternal and Child Health Services Block Grant funding. For more information and resources related to COVID-19 in Arizona, or to learn how to become a member, please visit us at azaap.org. And as always, in the meantime, hang in there, keep your heads up, and keep praying for a rapid end to this Omicron. Thanks, y'all.